I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about Russia's testing of tactical nuclear weapons, we have with us Heather Williams, who's the director of our project on nuclear issues at CSIS. Heather, welcome to the podcast. I wanted to ask you right out of the gate, earlier this month, Russia said it would practice the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons as part of a military exercise. Why is this significant? And obviously it's significant, but why does this matter?
Yeah, so this is really significant because it just is the latest in Russia ratcheting up the nuclear risk, right? So since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has relied on nuclear risks. It's kind of like this backstop. It's a way of signaling we care about this conflict more than you, the West, NATO care about it. And so since basically the very first day of the invasion, Putin has been throwing around these nuclear risks through nuclear rhetoric, suggesting that Russia cares about this conflict enough that it would resort to nuclear use. And so in some ways, this is just the latest in that trend. It's really important to see this as part of that bigger context. But this is kind of another level of escalation. So it's saying that Russia will conduct exercises involving tactical nuclear weapons. Hopefully, it doesn't involve an actual test of a nuclear weapon. Just a few months ago, Russia de-ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and a lot of folks have been saying Russia might move to nuclear testing. I don't think that they're going to actually test anything in this exercise, but the exercises themselves, they involve Belarus. Russia has thousands of these weapons. They're taking place during a particularly dangerous time in a risky area. And so just in general, this is kind of the latest in Russia's nuclear saber rattling, but it does take things to another level.
So just to sum up what you're saying, they're basically trying to send the United States and the West a message, correct?
Correct. They're a bully. They're bullying and trying to say, we care about this enough to use the ultimate weapon, that we might break the nuclear taboo that has held since 1945. And whether or not they would actually use nuclear weapons, this is hotly debated in the field. I'm somewhere in between the alarmists and the people who think, no, they would never do it. But it continues to be a really hot debate of whether or not they actually would. I think the really important thing to emphasize here, though, is that they want us to think that. They want us to think that they would use nuclear weapons to bully us out of the conflict and to try to push us off of it. And so trying to manipulate Western perception is a really important factor in Russia's overall strategy.
Before I get to the part about how seriously should we take them, which you just alluded to, I want to ask, what are some of the specific types of tactical exercises they could engage in if they decided to?
So we don't actually have a ton of details about what the exercises will entail. We know that it is the Southern Military District that will be participating, and that it will involve the 12th GUMO, which is the part of the Russian military responsible for nuclear weapons. We also know that Belarus will be involved. I believe today or tomorrow, Putin is going to Belarus to talk about these exercises and how they're proceeding. Supposedly, the drills began on May 21st. And in this first stage of the exercising, it will involve the Iskandar and the Kinjal missiles, which can carry nuclear weapons. In terms of what they're actually going to be doing in the exercises, I genuinely don't know the answer to that one. But I think that it's involving Belarus. Russian nuclear weapons are deployed to Belarus, according to Lukashenko and Putin. And then also just being really explicit about the drills. That was something I actually probably should have said at the outset. I've talked to some Russian experts and read some of the Russian reporting on this. And the first thing that they all jump to is that Putin is talking about it. In the past, the Russian political leadership would never talk about military exercises. They would never talk about nuclear drills or the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And so while this might be a signal that is being sent to the West, it also is clearly being picked up by domestic audiences and seen as something unprecedented.
With all this scary talk and Putin puffing out his chest and Lukashenko and Belarus doing the same as Putin's ultimate sycophant, is the West scared about this? Is it working?
So I'm going to answer that by trying to show both sides of this argument, because it really depends which side of the debate you're on, I think. So there is an argument to say that, yes, it is working. Arguably, Russian nuclear threats might have delayed Western intervention in the very beginning of the war. It might have delayed some Western support, like ATACMS or other capabilities that Ukraine was really desperate for. And arguably, the US in particular was a bit slow getting these resources and these capabilities to the Ukrainians. And so I think that for a lot of folks, there is a case that Russia has scared off the West, that Russia has played NATO and Western domestic audiences to some extent. I think that would be true at the beginning of the conflict, perhaps. But since then, on the other side of the debate, you could say, well, some folks would argue the West was never going to put boots on the ground. Like the US was never going to put boots on the ground. So you can't really say that the reason that we haven't is because of Russia. It's more complicated than that. However, Russia has put down some red lines that we have very slowly but gradually crossed. And that includes things like direct military aid to Ukraine, providing training for the Ukrainians. And now, obviously, there's this debate about whether or not US weapons can be used by the Ukrainians to hit military targets in Russia itself. And so, arguably, though, that bullying and those threats haven't really worked because the West has gradually kind of pushed back on these red lines. We had that statement from Scholz and Macron yesterday, I think it was, saying that they think Ukraine has the right to defend itself, and that might include hitting certain military targets within Russia. So there's that case to be made. But I think if we can zoom out just a little bit and look at the bigger picture of why Russia is making these nuclear threats, a lot of it is bullying. A lot of it is signaling to say, we care about this more than you do. But an additional goal of this strategy is to divide the allies. That going into the war, Putin seemed to think that NATO unity would not hold, that the 30 at the time members would fall apart and would be so divided about what to do about the invasion, about what to do about nuclear threats, that NATO support would really crumble. And I suspect he probably made a similar bet about US domestic politics, which may or may not be playing out as he expected. But within NATO, one of the biggest surprises of this whole war has been not only did NATO hold together, it got bigger. We got 2 new members. I mean, for Vladimir Putin, this should be a worst case scenario that you wanted to divide the alliance. Instead, you made it stronger, you made it bigger. And so I think that that is also some of the evidence to potentially suggest that Russia's nuclear bullying has not had the desired effect.
It's a really good point. So in thinking about that, are there any preventative measures being discussed by international bodies, NATO, in response to these drills and exercises?
So I can't really say if there's anything being done specifically about these exercises, but there are a lot of ideas floating around about what to do about rising nuclear risks, particularly coming from Russia. And it really covers the spectrum of views on nuclear issues. No surprise, the nuclear field is small, wonky, and disagrees with each other on the majority of things. For a lot of folks, what they want, what they think the response should be is strengthen our deterrent, show our resolve to our allies, and convince Vladimir Putin, if God forbid you did ever use one of these, we will make it the worst day and possibly the last day of your regime and of your leadership. And so deterrence, in that sense, is a risk reduction tool. It is the ultimate risk reduction tool in some ways of trying to signal back to Putin, don't do this. It will come with really heavy costs. But there are also some other risk reduction and arms control ideas that are being floated around. So there are some crisis communication channels between the US and Russia. There was a hotline that was set up following the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a nuclear risk reduction center. There's a really big nuclear conference for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty coming up at the end of July. And so there's a lot of ideas going around right now about how can we reduce the risks of nuclear escalation and nuclear use, greater transparency, having dialogues about what our doctrines are. But here's the real challenge with that. This administration has tried repeatedly to have those one-on-one dialogues with the Russians, to have strategic stability dialogues, to extend existing arms control agreements. And the consistent response from Moscow is just no, like they won't even come to the table. And that to me signals a couple things. It signals that Russia just doesn't want arms control right now. But it also signals to me Russia wants to increase risk. Like, why would you engage in risk reduction when that is the antithesis of what your strategy is? And so I really commend the administration for repeatedly trying to get the Russians to the table, trying to do the responsible thing. But this is part of Russia's strategy. And so that just doesn't seem to be in their interest right now.
So this doesn't leave the Biden administration with too many options. What's the thought process now, given the reality of Russia not coming to the table?
I'll be honest, I think the administration's still figuring that out a little bit, that they are getting pressure on all sides. A few weeks ago, Senator Markey and a couple other members of Congress, for example, sent a letter to the president and the whole administration essentially saying, we urge you to restart these talks with the Russians. And, I mean, I commend the idea behind that. Nuclear risks are certainly on the rise. That is Russia's intention. There are a series of incidents when Russia seemed to want us to think that they would go to nuclear use. We don't know if they actually would. And so I really do agree with the underlying sentiment of that letter and of other efforts like that, which is let's try again on the dialogue, because God forbid if a nuclear weapon were used, we should be able to say we did everything humanly possible to avoid this from happening. At the same time, I have seen this administration try everything humanly possible to get the Russians to the table on these issues. And there comes a point, how many times do you keep asking when you start running a risk that Russia might try to use it as leverage or something like that? I think it's also important to point out, like, this president is deeply committed to arms control, nonproliferation, nuclear issues, and came in clearly with a personal agenda, not just to reduce nuclear risk, but to really strengthen the nuclear architecture and infrastructure that we have. And so in some ways, it's a little bit tragic that think about all the presidents since Ronald Reagan, Biden probably knows and cares about nuclear issues more than any of them, but he also inherited a really, really crappy security environment when making progress on these issues just is impossible. There is one direction that the administration's taking that I think is a really interesting one, which is they're pushing this approach, behavioral arms control, which is trying to build kind of international consensus to acknowledge there are certain risky behaviors. Let's just not do them. For example, direct to send ASAT testing. That is one thing that the administration led a ban on. Artificial intelligence and nuclear command and control. And then just last month, the administration tried to put through a UN resolution banning the deployment of nuclear weapons in outer space. And so I think that's an interesting approach because it's trying to build international pressure and consensus around nuclear risk reduction. But no surprise, the Russians are not engaging on that.
Regarding the satellite issue, you wrote on this for the New York Times last month. Tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, so a couple months ago, Chairman Mike Turner, quick plug for Pony at CSIS, we will actually be hosting an event with Mike Turner on June 20th to talk about this nuclear modernization, a whole host of other issues with the Aerospace Security Program as a partner. So if you are interested in hearing more about this and Chairman Turner's views, go to our website and register for the event. But Chairman Mike Turner came out and flagged that there was something deeply concerning going on with regards to something Russia was doing in space. What we subsequently found out was that was involving potential deployment of a nuclear weapon in space that would be a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. There's been a lot of reporting by the New York Times. David Sanger has done great work on this. Wall Street Journal has also had some recent articles that suggest that a couple years ago, Russia was looking into testing out whether or not they could actually deploy a nuclear weapon in space. We don't know if they actually have yet. It seems like probably not if they're still testing it and looking into those options. But as my co-author, Carrie Bingen, on the New York Times piece, she has made the really great case and made me smart on this, that we rely on space for everything that we do, right? The recording of this podcast, the phone that people are listening to it on, the car that you might be driving that's playing it, the GPS to get you, every single thing we do is relying on space-based assets. And so for Russia to have a nuclear weapon in space, they literally could be holding all of those assets at risk. And so this is,
Which
the
is really
title of our
mind-blowing when you
it,
think
it,
about it.
it is. It's incredible. And so Carrie and I, the title of our article was a Sputnik moment question mark, because if Russia did go through with this, it really could have major strategic consequences.
So if they do something like that, then we, of course, need to do something to counter it, correct?
We do. I don't know what that looks like. I would not suggest that we take like for like action here. There is a treaty prohibiting the placement of WMD in outer space, which Russia is still a party to, and which I think we should continue to uphold. But it's almost like a whole nother type of a space race where that's a really scary prospect and environment, particularly because some of the interesting debates about this are how reliant is Russia on space-based assets compared to the West? It seems like Russia has not been too dependent on a lot of those systems for the war in Ukraine. Obviously, like all of us, they will be dependent on satellites for other things, but that this might be an asymmetric vulnerability for the US in particular.
It's really an incredible set of issues to talk about. And I think back to our friend Senator Sam Nunn from Georgia, former chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the late Dick Lugar, who spent so much time on these issues. And we have these treaties, we have these agreements, but they don't seem to be holding now in this age of Russia attacking Ukraine. What about the things that we have in place? Is there anything that the United States and the West can do to reinforce this if Russia won't come to the table?
Yeah, there's no sugarcoating it. It is a really grim picture for arms control. The optimistic view of it is that we are in an arms control interregnum, that this is as low as we will ever go, and we'll figure out a way to climb ourselves out of this era of the interregnum and we'll revitalize and resuscitate arms control efforts. That's the optimistic view of it. Obviously, the pessimistic view is that arms control is just gone and dead forever. The view that I take on this is more that arms control as we know it is dead. Of the old school, and by that I mean legally binding, verifiable, bilateral nuclear treaties. We probably just aren't going to get things like that going forward. I actually asked some folks on the Pony team to do a little check and see which nuclear treaties are still fully in place and that Russia has not sullied in some way. And I think it was like 4. And that includes the Seabed Treaty, the Antarctic Treaty, the Moon Treaty, and then I can't even remember what the 4th one was. So during the Cold War and the post-Cold War, we built this really beautiful architecture of arms control that was meant to reduce risks. And it was things like what Senators Nunn and Lugar did with cooperative threat reduction programs. And now that beautiful architecture, Russia's just dismantling it piece by piece. They basically violate any treaty that they're a party to, or they de-ratify, or they suspend participation. And so the landscape right now is really all we have left is the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START. That's pretty much all that's left. That expires in February 2026. Not likely to be anything that follows on from it. I don't think we're going to renew it or do another extension of it. And so this is the moment when arms control and risk reduction tools would really be incredibly valuable, things like crisis communication channels. But the toolkit's pretty low, if not empty at this stage. But I do want to stress, I think a point that gets lost a lot, it's not like the West and the Biden administration haven't tried. I mean, even the Trump administration tried. The Trump administration put forward a proposal for a warhead-based arms control agreement. This is very much Russia systematically dismantling all of the institutions and tools for reducing nuclear risks.
So Heather, I have to ask, does this embolden other rogue states with nuclear weapons and maybe not even rogue states, other states with nuclear weapons to conduct drills and exercises and puff their chests out?
I think it really depends on what happens in the coming months and how the international community as a whole responds to what Russia is doing. To be sure, Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un are watching this, and they are going to take lessons learned. How valuable are nuclear weapons? How valuable is nuclear bullying in a regional crisis? Because that's part of their strategic trajectory considerations. We don't know what direction that's going to go, but they're definitely interested in these issues as well. And so I think one of the big questions is whether or not Putin gets away with this. Thus far, he kind of has, as I said, I think there's evidence on both sides of whether or not he has deterred the West. And in some ways he hasn't, but nobody's really held him accountable for raising nuclear risks to the highest level really since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That the international community is not taking him to task or telling him, oh, you really need to slow things down and back down here. We do think that Chinese and Indian leadership called Putin in fall 2022 when risks were particularly high, and that may have had some influence. But other than that, I just don't see a lot of evidence for people holding Putin accountable. And so what these other countries take away from these ongoing exercises really depends on how the rest of the international community responds in the next few weeks and months.
Heather, finally, I want to ask you, what are some of the other provocative actions that we could expect from Russia in the near future?
Some other provocative actions that I am on the lookout for, I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say that these are likely or not likely, but they're definitely things that I want to watch for. First and foremost is whether or not Russia returns to nuclear testing. When they de-ratified the CTBT, they claimed it was because of Western aggression, and the US and China haven't ratified the CTBT, and that's also important to acknowledge. But as Russia keeps ratcheting up these nuclear risks, how far can you take that? A nuclear test would definitely escalate things. And so if Russia continues to get some perceived value from this nuclear bullying, at some point a nuclear test might be on the cards. So that's one thing that I would definitely continue to watch for. Another one will be, it might be additional exercises, but it has to do with Russia's relationship with Belarus on nuclear issues. It's still not totally clear to me what this looks like. If they envision a nuclear partnership with Belarus, is that meant to be kind of a mirror image of NATO's nuclear relationship? Belarus, are they in charge of the nuclear weapon? We don't think so. It's hard to envision Putin giving away that control. Lukashenko has claimed that Belarus might own them. And so I think watching to try to see a bit more, is Putin going to use Belarus and use Lukashenko somehow to kind of ratchet that up? That's another thing that I think is still, there's a lot of question marks around that one. And then I'll just say kind of the last one, this is a bit of a softer issue, but it's something I'm going to watch closely because I think we'll get some really interesting data and signposts out of it. It is actually this big NPT meeting coming up at the end of July. The meeting 2 years ago, Russia really derailed the entire process. And it was in the last 48 hours. But that process itself was incredibly telling about internal thinking within Russia, about nuclear issues, about some of the bureaucratic politics going on in Russia right now. And so this meeting in July could be a really unique opportunity to hear what Russia is thinking about nuclear issues, hear how other parts of the world, like the BRICS countries, Global South countries, how they're thinking about this. But I'm going to be watching that really closely just to see if Russia has any intention of letting go of this nuclear bullying strategy and re-engaging on risk reduction.
Heather, this is a fascinating and scary discussion. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. This is a great conversation. Scary indeed.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.